John Wyatt yanked the reins so hard his horse screamed. Harlan Pike had ridden back with one horse. One. And the pack animal he'd left with the one carrying a woman was gone. Gone. John's jaw locked tight. His eyes cut across the blinding wall of dust rolling in from the south. Something was wrong. He felt it the way a man feels a crack forming under his boots before the earth opens up. She's still out there. If this story moves something in you, subscribe, stay till the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 did not come gentle to Caldwell County, Texas. It came like a punishment. The heat had been cruel since April, baking the red clay earth until it cracked like old leather-driving cattle, half mad with thirst, turning the creek behind John Wyatt's property into a thin, muddy trickle that barely wet a horse's fetlocks. By July, the sky had turned a shade of white that wasn't sky at all. It was haze. It was heat made visible. It sat on a man's shoulders like a yoke and pressed him down toward the ground. John Wyatt had learned to live inside that kind of weight. He was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that told the story of a man who had built everything he owned from raw land and sweat and stubbornness. He ran 1,200 acres east of Caldwell, the largest working cattle operation in the county. Men who'd ridden for him 10 years still called him Mr. Wyatt when they handed him a report. Not because he demanded it. Because something in the way he stood still deliberate like a man who had already decided the outcome of every conversation before it started made formality feel natural. He had money. He had land. He had a reputation that stretched 3 counties in every direction. What John Wyatt did not have was anyone waiting for him when he walked through the door at night. He'd stopped expecting that. He told himself he'd made his peace with it. Most days, he almost believed it. He was checking the south fence line that Tuesday afternoon when he heard the hoofbeats. He recognized Harlan Pike's roan gelding before he saw the rider wide-chested horse with a crooked blaze down its nose, always moving, like it resented being ridden. Harlan came up the trail at a hard canter, hunched forward, not looking left or right. John straightened. He'd been mending a section of wire, and he set down his pliers without rushing, watching the man ride closer. What pulled the air out of John's lungs was not Harlan. It was the second lead rope trailing empty behind the gelding. That morning, Harlan had ridden out with 2 horses. John had seen him from the ridge, the gelding out front, and behind it, a brown pack mare loaded with supply bags. And a rider. A woman small and straight-backed, sitting the mare with the careful posture of someone who hadn't been on a horse in a long time. Now there was no mare, no supplies, no woman. John stepped into the trail. "Pike." Harlan didn't slow his horse. "Pike?" John's voice didn't rise, but it hardened the way iron hardens when it cools. "Pull up." Harlan finally reined in maybe 20 feet out. He looked, and there was no other word for it, rattled. His face was flushed past what the heat alone could explain. His eyes didn't quite settle on John's. "Wyatt?" A short nod, the greeting of a man who wants to pass. "You went out with 2 horses this morning," John said. Harlan's jaw shifted. "Mare spooked. Threw the bags and bolted south. Gone into the flats, I reckon." John looked at the empty lead rope, then at the sky to the south where the horizon had turned a dark, churning brown. The dust wall was coming. He could smell it already, that dry copper and dirt smell that meant the wind was about to turn savage. "The woman," John said. Something moved across Harlan's face. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who had made a calculation and was now irritated that someone was questioning the math. "She'll find her way back," Harlan said. "It ain't my concern." John stared at him. He let the silence sit there between them long enough that Harlan's horse shifted beneath him. "She's your bride," John said. Harlan's eyes finally met his, cold, flat, slightly defensive. "She's a woman I paid passage for who turned out to be more trouble than she's worth. The Lord'll provide Wyatt. I got work to do." He clicked his tongue, nudged the gelding forward. John let him pass. He stood in the trail and watched the man ride away toward his property, and something settled inside John's chest. Not anger, not yet. Something older and quieter than anger. Something that lived in the part of him that remembered what it felt like to be responsible for another person's life. He looked south. The dust wall was maybe 40 minutes out, maybe less. The sky at its base had gone the color of old rust, and he could hear it now, that low, constant roar that meant the wind was moving 100,000 tons of Texas earth across the flats at 30 miles an hour. A woman alone in that on foot, without water in July heat, John walked back to where his horse was tied without letting himself think about it any further. Thinking about it would only complicate something that was already simple. He mounted up and rode south. He found her in 35 minutes, which meant she hadn't been moving or hadn't been moving fast. She was down in a shallow drainage ditch at the edge of the flats, pressed up against the crumbling bank, with her knees pulled to her chest and both arms wrapped around her head. The brown mare was nowhere. The supply bags were nowhere. There was nothing around her but red earth and scrub brush and the wall of dust bearing down from the south like the end of something. John dismounted fast. He dropped to one knee beside her. "Ma'am." She flinched so violently she nearly knocked herself backward. Her head came up, and for a half-second before fear locked her expression back down, John saw her face clearly. Young. Younger than he'd expected. Maybe 25. Hair the color of dark chestnuts plastered to her temples with sweat half loose from whatever pins had been holding it. A dress that had started the morning clean and was now coated in red dust from the collar to the hem. Her eyes wide dark brown, scanning him with the rapid calculation of an animal deciding whether to run, were bloodshot from the dust and the sun. Her lips were cracked. "I'm not going to hurt you," John said. He kept his voice low, the same voice he used with green horses. "My name is John Wyatt. I have a ranch about a mile north of here. I need you to stand up and get on my horse before that wall hits us." She looked past him at the dust storm. Her throat worked. "Can you stand?" he asked. "Yes." The word came out rough, stripped by the heat. But she was already pushing herself upright, and John noted that she didn't wait for him to help her. She grabbed the bank edge with both hands and hauled herself up on her own. She swayed once. He put a hand under her elbow, and she let him, but he could feel the slight stiffening in her arm that said she'd rather not. She's got spine, he thought. Harlan Pike left a woman with spine out here to die. He got her onto the horse behind him. She held on without being told to. Arms around his waist, grip tight and businesslike, not clinging, just holding on with the focused practicality of a woman who had decided that surviving this moment mattered more than maintaining distance. They made the ranch house with about 10 minutes to spare before the storm hit. John's housekeeper, May Givens, was 61 years old, built like a barrel, and twice as solid. And in 20 years of working for the Wyatt family, she had seen enough strange things come through that front door that she had developed an expression of supreme, unflappable neutrality for deploying in unusual circumstances. She deployed it now watching John walk through the front door with a young woman covered in red dust and barely upright. "May?" John said, "This is—" He stopped. He realized in that moment that he didn't know her name. He looked at her. She looked at him. And despite everything, the heat, the dust, the cracked lips, and the hollow eyes, something flashed briefly in her expression, a recognition of the absurdity of the moment. "Clara," she said, "Clara Edwards." A pause. I'm Harlan Pike's—" The word bride seemed to catch in her throat. "He sent for me from St. Louis. I arrived 3 days ago." May's neutrality flickered, just briefly. 3 days, May repeated. "Yes, ma'am." May looked at John. John looked at May. A conversation passed between them in that look that required no words at all. "Come on then, honey," May said, and put a firm, gentle arm around Clara's shoulders. "Let's get you cleaned up and find you something cool to drink before you fall over." Clara let herself be led. At the doorway to the hall she stopped and looked back at John. "Mr. Wyatt," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Thank you." Don't thank me yet, John said. Wait until you see what kind of trouble you're in. It was meant to lighten the moment, but it wasn't untrue. The storm blew through in 2 hours and left the world scoured and orange-hued in its wake. John sat on the front porch through most of it, listening to the wind tear at the eaves, thinking about Harlan Pike's face when he'd said, "She ain't my concern," and the way he'd said it. Not like a man who'd made a mistake, like a man who'd made a decision. May brought him coffee when the wind died down, sat herself in the second chair without asking, and said nothing for a while. "She's asleep," May finally said. "Dehydrated. I'd wager she didn't eat today either. She's got some wind cuts on her arms and a bruise on her left cheekbone that I don't think came from falling off a horse." John's hand tightened around the coffee cup. "She say anything?" "Not much. She's not the kind that talks easy." May paused. "She's the kind that watches, takes everything in, like she's been in situations before where the wrong word cost her something." John thought about St. Louis. About a woman who'd answered an advertisement in a newspaper and made herself into a mail-order bride for a man she'd never met, traveling 1,000 miles to reach a Texas ranch and a stranger's life. That took either courage or desperation, and in John's experience, most women who made that journey had a measure of both. "She can't go back to Pike," May said. "I know that. He'll be coming for her." "I know that too." May looked at him sideways. "So what are you planning to do?" John drank his coffee. Outside, the last of the dust was settling, and the late afternoon light was coming through it in long amber shafts that turned the red earth gold. "I'm going to do what's right," he said. "Same as always." May made a sound that might have been approval and might have been concern, and was probably both. Harlan Pike arrived before supper. John heard the horse in the yard and stepped outside before the man could knock. He closed the door behind him. Harlan had cleaned himself up. He'd put on his good shirt, the gray one he wore to town meetings, and he'd slicked his hair back and arranged his face into the expression of a reasonable man who had a reasonable grievance. John had seen that expression on men before. It usually showed up right before they said something completely unreasonable. "Wyatt." Harlan touched the brim of his hat. "I understand you brought someone back in from the flats before the storm. I appreciate it. I'll take her off your hands." John stood in the doorway and said nothing. Harlan's pleasant expression held, but something behind his eyes was doing calculations. "She belonged to me," he said. "Paid her passage and the agency fee. Got the papers to prove it. You'd be within your rights to accept a small compensation for the trouble of, she's not a horse Pike." Harlan's jaw moved. "Well, no, but the principle—" "If you say the word principle to me right now," John said quietly, "I'm going to have a very hard time staying civil. So let's not." Silence. The last birds of the evening moved through the sky above them, heading toward the creek. "She's my wife," Harlan said. His voice had dropped the pleasantness. What was underneath it was flat and cold, and carried the particular edge of a man who was not accustomed to people telling him no. "What you're doing right now is called interference, Wyatt. A married man has rights under the law. You left her on foot in open country with a storm coming in July heat," John said. "If I hadn't ridden out, she would be dead right now. Whatever rights the law gives you, they don't include that." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. The calculation was happening openly now, visible on his face, measuring John's size, measuring his reputation, measuring the cost of a fight against a man who owned half the county. "I want to speak to her," Harlan said. "She's resting. I want to speak to her," Harlan said again. "She's my wife. You've got no legal standing to keep her from me, Wyatt, and you know it. All the land and money in the county don't change that." John was quiet for a moment. "She stays here tonight," he said. "She rests, she eats. Tomorrow, if she wants to speak to you, she can speak to you. In town, in front of other people." He let that land. "Not here. Not alone." Harlan's mouth thinned to a line. "You're making an enemy," he said. "I already had plenty," John said. "Good evening, Pike." He went back inside and closed the door. Clara was awake when May brought supper to the small room off the kitchen. She'd washed and changed into a dress May had found one of May's own, slightly too wide at the hips and slightly too short at the hem, but clean and cool. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, not relaxed exactly, but still, gathered. May set the tray down and said, "Mr. Pike came by." Clara's stillness shifted. Not fear, or not only fear. Something more controlled than fear. What did Mr. Wyatt say? "He sent him away," May said. "Told him you'd speak to him in town tomorrow if you chose to." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing "if you chose to." "He used those words," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Clara looked down at her hands. When she looked up, her expression was difficult to read, but May, who had been reading people for 61 years, thought it looked something like a woman encountering a concept she'd heard about but hadn't expected to find in practice. "I don't want to be a burden on him," Clara said. "I'll figure something out. I can work. I've worked my whole life. If there's somewhere in town, you can worry about all that tomorrow," May said firmly. "Tonight you eat something and you sleep. That's the only plan that matters right now." After May left, Clara sat alone with the tray and ate slowly at first, then hungrily, the way a person eats when they've been refusing to acknowledge how empty they are. When the food was gone, she stood and went to the window. The sky outside was deep blue, going to black. The last light drained out of the west, and somewhere out beyond the fence post, she could hear cattle settling, and somewhere farther out, a coyote calling across the dark. She had come 1,000 miles for a new life. She had not expected it to look like this. But she had also in the last 3 days stopped expecting anything good, and the fact that she was standing in a clean room with food in her stomach and a door that no one had opened without knocking. In a house where the man who owned it had looked Harlan Pike in the eye and said, "Good evening," like a closing of a chapter. Clara pressed her fingertips against the windowsill and breathed. Tomorrow would be hard. She knew that. Tomorrow she would have to be brave in ways she hadn't worked out yet. Tomorrow, Harlan Pike would make his move in front of a town that didn't know her, a town where he had standing and she had nothing. But she was alive, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach in Caldwell 3 days ago, she had something she hadn't had since she'd left Missouri. She had one person who, without asking anything from her, without knowing anything about her, had ridden into a summer dust storm because leaving her out there was simply not something he was willing to do. Clara Edwards had spent 25 years learning not to trust things that looked like salvation. But she was alive, and she listened to the coyote call out across the dark Texas plain, and she thought, not with hope exactly, because hope still felt dangerous, but with something cautious and careful, and not entirely without warmth. One day at a time, Clara. One day at a time. Down the hall, John Wyatt sat at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the knowledge that by morning Harlan Pike would have talked to half the county, and half the county would be watching to see what the richest man in Caldwell was willing to sacrifice for a woman he didn't even know. John already knew his answer. He just hadn't decided yet how much it was going to cost him. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge the next morning, John had already been up 2 hours. He'd slept badly, not because of guilt, and not because he'd made the wrong call the night before. He'd slept badly because he understood exactly what was coming, and his mind had spent the dark hours running through it the way a man runs his thumb across a knife edge, testing where it cuts. He was pouring his second cup of coffee when he heard boots in the hallway. Clara appeared in his kitchen doorway, already dressed, hair pinned back. May's borrowed dress exchanged for her own, the one she'd arrived in brushed clean as best as could be managed, but still carrying the red dust of yesterday in the weave of the fabric. She was carrying her small travel bag in one hand. John looked at the bag. "I'm not leaving," she said, reading his expression with a precision that surprised him. I don't want to leave anything behind, in case things go a direction this morning that doesn't bring me back here." John set down his coffee cup. "Where do you think you're going this morning?" "Into town," she said. "With you, if you'll allow it." He studied her. "You don't have to do that today. You could stay here with May. Give it a few days to—" "No." The word came out clean and flat, no apology attached to it. "I've given things a few days, Mr. Wyatt. It doesn't make them smaller. It just gives them more time to grow roots." She met his eyes. "I'd rather face it while I still have enough anger to hold me upright." John Wyatt had not expected to almost smile at 8 in the morning with Harlan Pike's trouble already moving through the county like weather. But there it was. "All right," he said. "We leave in 20 minutes. May appeared from the back of the kitchen, said nothing, and pressed a wrapped biscuit into Clara's hand with the authority of a woman who had decided that this was happening whether she approved of the timeline or not. The ride into Caldwell took 40 minutes at an easy pace, and they did most of it in silence, which was not uncomfortable, only thoughtful. Clara sat her horse, one of John's mares, a steady gray, with the same straight-backed composure he'd noticed when she was half dead in a ditch, and John found himself recalibrating again. He'd spent the better part of yesterday thinking of her as a victim. She was something more complicated than that. About halfway into town, she said without looking at him, "What did he tell people? Do you know?" "Not exactly," John said. "But I know Harlan Pike. He'll have told a version of yesterday that makes him reasonable and makes you the problem." Clara laughed. It was a short sound dry as the Texas earth. "I've been a problem my entire life according to men like Harlan Pike," she said. "I'm starting to think the problem might not be me." John glanced at her sideways. "When did you know," he asked, "that he wasn't what you expected?" She was quiet for a moment. "Hour 1, she said. "He met. The stage looked at me like he was checking the quality of a piece of livestock, and then told me I was thinner than he'd hoped." A pause. "I told myself I was being uncharitable, that first impressions don't account for nerves." Another pause shorter. "By the end of day 2, I'd stopped being uncharitable." "The bruise on your cheek," John said. The silence that followed was its own answer. John faced forward and said nothing more. But something in his chest had gone very still, in the particular way it went still when he was making a decision that he wouldn't be taking back. Caldwell, Texas. On a Wednesday morning was not a large town, but it was a busy one. The main street ran 4 blocks, with the general store, the telegraph office, a feed merchant, a bank, 2 saloons, 1 respectable, 1 less so, and a courthouse that doubled as the office of Sheriff Cal Briggs. By 9 in the morning, the plank sidewalks were moving with people. Horses were tied 3 deep at the hitching rails, and the particular social mechanism of a small town which processed information the way a mill processes grain, grinding it fine and distributing it to everyone within reach, had already been running for hours. John knew the moment they rode in that Harlan had been busy. He could see it in the way heads turned, in the way a conversation between 2 women outside the general store stopped, resumed, quietly stopped again. In the way Tom Adler, who ran the feed store, and had never in 10 years of doing business with John Wyatt been anything but cordial, gave him a nod that was fractionally shorter than usual. John kept his face neutral and rode to the hitching rail in front of the courthouse without altering his pace. Clara saw it too. He could feel it in the way she sat slightly straighter as they dismounted, the way her chin came up 1/4 of an inch. Not arrogance, but armor. He recognized the gesture. He'd used it himself more times than he could count. "Stay close," he said low. "I wasn't planning on wandering," she said. Chitong. They found Sheriff Cal Briggs in his office, which was how John had planned it. Cal was 60, gray-haired patient as a river stone and about as easy to move. He'd been sheriff of Caldwell County for 15 years, and in that time had developed a working philosophy about trouble that went roughly. Let it come to me, listen to all of it. Decide slowly. He looked up from his desk when John and Clara walked in, and his expression gave away nothing which told John that he'd already had at least one conversation this morning that he was holding in mind. "Wyatt," Cal said. Then to Clara, with the measured courtesy of a man who reserved judgment professionally, "Ma'am." "Cal," John said. He pulled up a chair for Clara and remained standing himself. "I expect you've heard something already." "I've heard Harlan Pike's version of something," Cal said. He folded his hands on the desk. I've learned over the years that Harlan's versions are accurate the way a cracked mirror is accurate. The shape is there, but something's off. He looked at Clara. Miss Edwards, would you like to tell me what happened yesterday? Clara set her hands in her lap, folded still. And she told him. She didn't embellish. She didn't soften. She described arriving in Caldwell 3 days earlier, the 2 days at Harlan's ranch, the ride toward what Harlan had described as a neighboring farm where she'd be staying, while arrangements were finalized. And the moment an hour into the ride when Harlan had stopped, the mayor told her to get down, taken the supply bags and ridden away. Cal listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You said arrangements, Cal said. What arrangements? Clara's expression shifted barely, but John caught it. He said the agency contract wasn't finalized, that he'd paid the passage but hadn't decided to proceed with the marriage. He wanted a trial period. Her voice stayed level. He said that was standard. It was not standard. John watched Cal's face register that fact, file it, and move on. The bruise, Cal said carefully. How'd you come by it? Clara met his eyes. Day 2. I burned his supper. The room was very quiet. Cal looked at John. John said nothing. Cal looked back at Clara. All right, Cal said. He stood up, which was itself a signal. Cal Briggs stood up when he'd made a decision. I'll want a written account, and I want to be clear with you. Miss Edwards, legally, the situation is not simple. The agency contract does have some standing, and until the marriage question is resolved, Pike may have some claim under... The office door opened. Harlan Pike walked in like he'd been standing outside waiting for his cue, which John realized coldly he probably had been. He had 2 men behind him, not hired guns, nothing that obvious. Len Craddock, who ran the bank and had been Harlan's business associate for 3 years, and Pastor William Foote, which was either calculated or the most cynical thing John had seen in a decade, and he couldn't decide which. Harlan looked at Clara with the expression of a man performing concern. There she is, he said, putting a note of relief into his voice that made John's teeth set. Clara, honey, I was worried sick. Clara went absolutely still. I've been looking everywhere for you, Harlan said, moving into the room like he owned it. When Mr. Wyatt took you in during the storm, I was grateful truly, but we need to get you home now. We've got a lot to work through, and I think with some time and some calm conversation... You told me to get down, Clara said. Her voice did not shake. It was not loud. It had the particular quality of a voice that has been quiet for a long time, and has finally decided that quiet was getting it nowhere. Harlan spread his hands. Now, sweetheart, you were upset. You took the water bags, Clara said. You took both of them. You knew the storm was coming. I could see the dust from where we were standing, and you knew exactly what that meant. She did not take her eyes off him. That wasn't an argument. That wasn't a misunderstanding. You made a decision. Harlan looked at Cal. His expression pivoted smoothly from concerned husband to reasonable man burdened by a difficult situation. You can see what I've been dealing with, he said. She's got an imagination, Sheriff. I tried to explain the horse spooked. The mayor didn't spook, John said. He said it quietly the way he said most things, but the room temperature shifted. I came out on that trail 10 minutes after you passed me. Your tracks were clear in the dust, yours heading north, hers heading south. The mayor's tracks ended about 40 yards from the ditch where I found Miss Edwards. The mare was unloaded where she stood. Those bags don't fall off a moving horse in a pattern like that. She was unloaded. Harlan turned to John. Something had left his face, the performance, the careful calibration of expression. What was under it was harder and less pleasant. You've got a lot of interest in another man's wife, Wyatt, he said. I've got a lot of interest in a woman who was left to die on land that borders mine, John said. I'd call that a neighborly concern. Cal, Harlan said, turning back to the sheriff. I need you to remind Mr. Wyatt of the legal standing here. This woman is under contract. She came to Texas under my sponsorship. I paid the agency, and until that contract is officially... Nobody's discussing contracts right now, Cal said. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume, but both Harlan and Len Craddock stopped talking. That was the particular authority of a man who had earned it. What I'm discussing is what happened on a public road yesterday during a dangerous weather event. I'll be formal account of both versions and sending a copy to the circuit judge. He looked at Harlan. In the meantime, Miss Edwards will be making her own decisions about where she stays and who she speaks to, and you will not be making those decisions for her. Are we clear? Harlan's face had gone a shade that was not quite red. You're taking his side because he's the biggest taxpayer in the... I'm applying the law, Cal said flatly, which as it turns out applies to everyone. Pastor Foote, who had said nothing throughout all of this, cleared his throat. He was a lean man with the kind of face that was built for delivering difficult news and had spent 40 years practicing. Perhaps, he said carefully. There is a path here that serves all parties. Brother Pike has made a considerable investment in good faith. If there are grievances on Miss Edwards' part, those can be addressed through proper channels. The church, Clara said, offered me a great deal of advice when my father was drinking away the family farm in Missouri. None of it changed the situation. What changed the situation was leaving. She looked at the pastor, not unkindly, but without any space for negotiation. I mean, no disrespect, Pastor Foote, but I've learned to tell the difference between counsel that helps me and counsel that helps everyone else be more comfortable with my suffering. The silence after that was complete. John watched three men process the experience of being quietly, precisely, and irrefutably corrected by a woman in a borrowed dress with dust still in her hair. Pastor Foote looked at his hat. Harlan looked at Clara with an expression that had finally dropped all pretense. And what was there, John catalogued it with the cold attention of a man who was deciding things was not heartbreak. It was not even anger. It was the expression of a man who had lost control of an asset he'd expected to keep. That told John everything he'd been uncertain about. They stepped outside 10 minutes later, after Cal had taken Clara's written account, and promised to have a deputy ride out to the spot on the road and document the evidence before the wind erased any more of it. Harlan and his associates had left before them. Harlan's exit had been the exit of a man saving a confrontation for better ground, not conceding it. John and Clara stood on the courthouse steps in the full July heat and did not speak for a moment. Around them, Caldwell went about its business with the slightly heightened quality of a town that had just been given something interesting to talk about. Two men John recognized from the Cattlemen's Association were watching from across the street, their conversation clearly paused. The woman from the general store doorway had moved to the window. That went about as well as it could have, Clara said. It could have gone better, John said. How? Harlan could have decided to be reasonable. He paused. He's not going to decide that. Clara looked at him sideways. What does that mean for me? John was quiet for a moment, watching the street, watching the people watching them. He was running the arithmetic of it, what Harlan would do next, what levers he had, what the town would do with what it had just seen. Harlan Pike was not a powerful man in the way John was powerful. He didn't have the land or the money, but he had something John had never bothered to cultivate. He had debts, the right kind of debts. He'd done small favors for the right people over 10 years, and he'd kept careful count of each one, and now he had a town full of people who owed him something small and would tip slightly in his direction without even noticing they were doing it. John had money and reputation. Harlan had a network. This was going to be a longer fight than one morning at the sheriff's office. It means, John said slowly, that you need to be careful about where you go alone and who you speak to without someone you trust nearby. He glanced at her. And it means you shouldn't plan on leaving Caldwell for a while. Not until this is settled. And where do I stay while it's being settled? He looked at her. She looked back at him, and they were both fully aware of what the town was going to say about whichever answer he gave. My ranch, he said. May's there. The room's yours as long as you need it. I'll have one of my hands sleep in the bunkhouse near the main house, rather than the far barn. People will talk, she said. People are already talking, he said. I stopped managing that particular problem a long time ago. Clara was quiet. She was looking out at the street, at the faces, at the particular way a small town holds a person in its gaze and measures them against a standard they didn't set and weren't asked about. He could see her feeling the weight of it. Then she breathed in, slow and deliberate, and he watched something settle in her the way it had settled in him on that trail yesterday, a decision that cost something and was made anyway. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked to the horses. They were halfway down the steps when John heard his name not from one direction, but from two almost simultaneously. Len Craddock calling from the bank doorway, pleasant and terrible. "Mr. Wyatt, a word about your quarterly note." And behind them from the courthouse door, the sound of boots on planks and Cal Briggs's voice lower and urgent. "John, something just came over the telegraph. You need to hear this." John stopped. He looked at Craddock. He looked back at Cal. He said to Clara quietly, "Stay on the steps. Don't move." And the morning, which had already been one kind of trouble, turned the corner into something else entirely. Cal Briggs did not use the word urgent lightly. In 15 years of sheriffing, John had heard the man raise his voice exactly twice, and both times involved firearms. So when Cal stood in the courthouse doorway, with that particular tightness around his eyes, John moved toward him fast and left Craddock waiting without a second glance. "What is it?" John said, stepping inside. Cal handed him the telegraph slip. "Came in 20 minutes ago. I was going to write out to you this afternoon, but since you're here." John read it. He read it a second time. The slip was from a Marshal Tom Haskell out of San Antonio, and it contained 2 sentences that rearranged everything John thought he understood about the morning he was having. Harlan Pike wanted for fraud and breach of agency contract, 3 counts San Antonio and Bazar County. Female complainants. Advise hold pending warrant. John stood very still for a moment. 3 counts, he said. That's what it says. Cal took the slip back. Means Miss Edwards isn't the first. Means he's done this before, brought women out here on contract, didn't follow through, and when they tried to get legal remedy, the agency filed fraud charges on his behalf. He filed charges against the women. Agency did, on his behalf. He's got a relationship with the agency owner. Cal folded the slip and put it in his breast pocket. Which means Miss Edwards, if she'd tried to go through the agency to get out of the contract, would have found herself the defendant instead of the complainant. John's jaw was tight. Does he know about the warrant? That's what I can't tell you. The marshal sent to the county seat too, but if Harlan's got a friend at the telegraph office. Tom Adler's brother works the telegraph office, John said. Cal looked at him. Then yes, he might know. They stared at each other for a half second, and then John was already moving back toward the door. Clara was exactly where he'd left her on the courthouse steps, but she was not alone. In the 2 minutes John had been inside, 3 women had arranged themselves in her vicinity, in the way that women of a certain social standing arrange themselves when they want to make a point without making a scene. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who ran the Caldwell Ladies' Auxiliary, and whose opinion functioned as a kind of weather system for the town's moral atmosphere, was standing 1 step below. Clara speaking to her in a low, pleasant tone that Clara was receiving with the expression of a woman who had been pleasant-toned at before and knew exactly what it cost. John stopped at the door. "Understand that Mr. Wyatt means well," Mrs. Crane was saying. "But surely you can see that a young woman staying at a single man's property, without proper arrangement, puts everyone in a difficult position. There are respectable boarding options in town. Mrs. Lyle takes in." "It's Miss Edwards," Clara said. "And I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Crane." Of course. I just think that for your own reputation—" "My reputation," Clara said with the same quiet, immovable quality she'd had in the sheriff's office, "was already decided by this town before I stepped off the stage 3 days ago. I arrived as Harlan Pike's mail-order bride, which I understand is not a status that comes with much social standing. Now I'm the woman John Wyatt pulled out of a ditch during a dust storm, which I understand is not a status that comes with much less." She tilted her head slightly. "So I think I'll make my choices based on what's safe, rather than what's socially convenient, if it's all the same to you." Dorothy Crane opened her mouth and then closed it. John came down the steps. "Dorothy," he said with the flat courtesy of a man ending a conversation, Morning. Mrs. Crane looked between them, recalibrated, and withdrew with the dignity of a woman who processed this further in a different location with more sympathetic company. John touched Clara's elbow. We need to move. Now. She read his face. What happened? I'll tell you on the way. Walk, don't run. They made it to the horses before Len Craddock cut them off. Craddock was 55, soft through the middle, with the perennially friendly expression of a banker who had spent his career making bad news sound like an administrative inconvenience. He stepped out from between two horses at the rail with the timing of a man who had been watching the courthouse door. Mr. Wyatt, he said warmly. I did want a quick word about the quarterly note on the East Pasture parcels. Just a routine matter, but given the circumstances, I thought sooner was better. John stopped. What circumstances? Len Craddock's friendliness held. Well, you know, any unusual activity on a property can affect the assessment of. Are you telling me that sheltering a woman from a dust storm affects the assessment of my loan? Craddock spread his hands. I'm saying it's worth a conversation. Nothing alarming. Just the bank has certain interests to protect, as I'm sure you understand. John looked at him for a long moment. He understood exactly what was happening. He understood who had been in Craddock's office that morning, and what had been said, and what the offer on the table probably looked like. My quarterly note is current, John said. By 43 days as of last week. You know that because you signed the receipt yourself. He kept his voice pleasant. If the bank develops concerns about a fully current loan, because I exercised basic human decency, I'd suggest the bank prepare to explain that reasoning to the circuit judge, who I have lunch with every third Thursday. Are we done? Craddock's smile had gone slightly fixed. Of course. Just keeping lines of communication open. Always appreciate that, John said and stepped around him. He untied both horses, handed Clara her reins, and they were mounted and moving before Craddock had turned around. He told her about the telegraph on the road out of town, straight and fast, the way he told May things, no softening, no managing. Just the facts in order. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and he let the quiet be. 3 others, she finally said. At least 3 with formal complaints. And the agency helped him. Agency helped him. Another silence longer. He could hear her processing it, not just the information, but the particular weight of discovering that what happened to you was not an accident and not a first. That somewhere behind you are other women who walked the same road and hit the same wall, and some of them hit it harder than you did. I should feel better knowing that, Clara said. Knowing it wasn't something about me specifically that. She stopped. I don't feel better knowing it. No, John said. That makes sense. How does that make sense? Because you're not just angry at Harlan Pike anymore, he said. You're angry at a system that made it possible. That's a bigger thing to be angry at. Takes longer to get your arms around. She looked at him sideways the way she did when he said something that required a moment to settle. You think about things like that, she said. I've had a lot of quiet years, he said. Gives a man time to think. May was waiting at the gate, which meant she'd been watching the road, which meant she'd already heard something. May had a network in Caldwell that would have embarrassed a military intelligence operation. She took one look at their faces and opened the gate wider. Harlan's been to see Reverend Foote again this morning, she said without preamble. After you left the courthouse. My friend Alice's girl works the parsonage kitchen. He was there a half hour, and Len Craddock rode out to the old Tanner property, Harlan's eastern neighbor, around the same time. John dismounted and handed his reins to the hand who'd appeared at his shoulder. What's at the Tanner property? Nothing far as I know, but Frank Tanner's wife is Dorothy Crane's niece. May looked at John levelly. He's building something, piece by piece. I know, John said. He knows about the warrant. May absorbed this. How much time do we have? Before what? Clara asked. She'd dismounted herself, was standing with her travel bag over her shoulder, looking between them with the focused attention of someone who had decided that not being informed was a disadvantage she could no longer afford. John and May exchanged a look. "Before he does something that makes the warrant harder to execute," John said. "If he leaves the county before the marshal arrives, the warrant's harder to serve. If he moves assets or aligns enough local opinion before, then the whole thing gets messy. Small towns have a way of complicating things that should be simple." "He could dispute the charges," Clara said slowly. "Say the other women were the same as me, difficult, made things up, whatever story plays best." She paused. "If he builds enough goodwill here first, any jury in the county is going to look at this like his word against 3 women's." She'd laid it out in about 30 seconds, clean and clear, and both John and May were looking at her. "Yes," John said, "exactly that." Clara set her bag down on the porch step. "Then we can't wait for the marshal to come to us." "What are you suggesting?" May said. "The marshal's warrant will get here when it gets here," Clara said. "But a warrant only does something if there are people here who are willing to believe it. Right now, Harlan's using every hour to make sure those people are in his camp before the warrant arrives." She looked at John. "You have standing in this town. Real standing, not the kind Harlan's buying. People who respect you because you've earned it." She paused. "Can you call that in?" John studied her. He had been thinking exactly the same thing, and hearing it come out of her mouth, not as a question, but as a strategic reading of the board, settled something in him that had been uncertain since the courthouse. "I can make some calls," he said, "but I want to be clear about something first." He looked at her directly. "Once I do that, once I start moving that kind of weight, this becomes a fight that the whole county sees. You'll be in the middle of it. People will have opinions about you, loud ones, and not all of them will be kind." "People already have opinions about me," Clara said. "The difference is that right now, those opinions are all Harlan's." John was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "All right." What happened next happened fast. John sent 2 of his hands into town with specific messages for specific men. Older ranchers' men who had been in Caldwell County long enough to remember when Harlan Pike had arrived 15 years ago from somewhere up north and built himself a modest spread on the proceeds of what he'd always described vaguely as investment capital. Men who had done business with John Wyatt for a decade and knew the weight of his word. By 3 in the afternoon, 4 men were at John's kitchen table. Clara sat at the end of it. May stood at the counter with a coffee pot and the expression of a woman prepared to be a witness. John laid out the telegraph information. He did not editorialize. He presented the facts, the warrant, the 3 prior women, the agency relationship, the pattern, and let the facts do the work. The oldest rancher, a man named Walt Prescott, who'd been in Caldwell since before it had a name, said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. "You're one of 4, he said. "That I know of," she said. Walt chewed on that. "I sold Harlan a water easement 3 years ago," he said. "He told me the woman on the neighboring property had signed off on the survey. She hadn't. I found out 6 months later." A pause. "I let it go because it wasn't worth the fight." A second man, George Hadley, cleared his throat. "He filed a complaint against my foreman 2 years back. Said the man had stolen a saddle. Never proved, but the man left the county rather than deal with it." He looked at John. "I always thought it was convenient. My foreman was the one who'd seen Harlan water diluting his grain sales at the co-op." John let them talk. He understood what was happening, not a conspiracy, but the opposite of one. The slow, halting process of people who had each carried a small private suspicion, beginning to understand that their suspicions were the same suspicion. It was Clara who said quietly into a pause, "He counts on everyone deciding it's not worth the fight. Individually." She looked around the table. "That's the whole system." The room was quiet. Walt Prescott looked at John. "What do you need from us?" Harlan Pike made his move at 4:30. He came not to the ranch, but to town, to the square in front of the general store where the late afternoon foot traffic was at its highest. He came with Pastor Foote and Dorothy Crane and Len Craddock, and he had a paper in his hand that he said was an affidavit from the agency in San Antonio, swearing that Clara Edwards had breached the terms of her own contract by abandoning the arranged residence without notice. John heard about it in 12 minutes because May's network did not sleep. He rode into town with Clara beside him, and Walt Prescott and George Hadley behind them, and he did not hurry, because hurrying gave the impression of a man on the defensive, and John Wyatt had decided he was done being on the defensive. The square was crowded. Harlan saw them coming, and something moved across his face. The calculation again, rapid and cold, and he straightened and held his ground. John dismounted in full view of the assembled crowd and walked toward Harlan Pike, and the sound of his boots on the dry earth was the only sound in the square. He stopped 6 feet away. "Harlan," he said. "Wyatt." Harlan held up the paper. "I've got a legal document here that—" "The warrant from Marshal Haskell in San Antonio arrived at the sheriff's office 18 minutes ago," John said. "John, that was not true. Not yet." But John had sent a writer to the county seat at noon, and he knew the timing, and he watched the blood leave Harlan Pike's face, and he knew he was right. That's a misunderstanding," Harlan said, and the performance was still there, but it was cracking at the edges. "San Antonio is a separate matter from 3 women, John said. He said it to Harlan, but he said it to the crowd. 3 women before Clara, same pattern. Contract passage arrival abandonment. The agency filed fraud charges against the women when they complained. Because the agency owner is Harlan's brother-in-law." The square was so quiet he could hear the sign above the general store moving in the evening breeze. "That's a lie," Harlan said. His voice was sharp now, the pleasantness gone completely. "That is a lie, and I'll see you in court for—" "Walt," John said. Walt Prescott stepped forward. He was 70 years old and had been in Caldwell County before the courthouse existed, and when he spoke, people in this town listened the way they listened to the land itself. "I've known this man's methods for 3 years," Walt said, and he said it to the crowd, not to Harlan, because the crowd was what mattered. "I let it go once. That was my mistake. I'm correcting it now." George Hadley stepped up beside him. Harlan looked at the 2 men. He looked at the crowd. He was doing the calculation one more time, and for the first time, John could see him arriving at a number he didn't like. Pastor Foote took a small, almost imperceptible step backward. Dorothy Crane looked at her shoes. "You have no proof," Harlan said. His voice had changed again, quieter, more dangerous, with the particular edge of a man who has run out of performances and is operating on something rawer. He looked directly at Clara, past John, past everyone. "You think you've won something here? You're nobody. You came here with nothing. You have nothing, and when this is done—" "She has the truth," John said. He stepped slightly to the side so he was beside Clara rather than in front of her, because this moment was not his. "And she has her name, which is hers, and her account, which is on record, and the accounts of 3 other women which are also on record." He looked at Harlan with the full, undeflectable weight of a man who had made his decision and was standing in it. "What do you have, Harlan?" Harlan Pike stood in the square of a town he had spent 15 years cultivating, and he looked at the faces around him, and what he found there was not what he'd expected to find. The crowd was not with him, not against him either, not yet, not entirely. A small town reserves full judgment until it absolutely has to commit. But the tide of it, the lean of it, the quiet direction of 100 small calculations happening simultaneously in 100 people who had all done at least one small piece of business with Harlan Pike and filed at least one small private reservation, that tide had shifted. He felt it. John could see him feel it. Len Craddock was already moving toward the bank. Pastor Foote had found something important to examine on the church steps across the street. Harlan looked at John one final time, and what was there was not defeat, not yet, but the look of a man storing something away for a different occasion. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," John agreed. "It isn't." Harlan walked away. The crowd exhaled. And Clara Edwards, standing in the middle of a Texas town square, in the full heat of a July afternoon, in borrowed clothes, with her past in ruins around her, tilted her face up slightly toward the sky, and breathed in slow and steady, the way a person breathes when they have just survived something they weren't entirely sure they would survive. John stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. But May Givens, who had ridden into town 20 minutes ago without being asked, and was standing at the edge of the crowd, with her coffee-worn hands folded in front of her, watched the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder in that square, and she thought with the certainty of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the start of things, that this was not the end of anything. This was where something began. Harlan Pike left the square like a man who had somewhere important to be, and that was what worried John most. A man who left angry and humiliated with nowhere to go broke something on his way out. A man who left with purpose was building something. John had watched enough people walk away from losing positions to know the difference, and what he'd seen in Harlan's shoulders as he crossed the square was not the slump of defeat. It was the set of a man who had already started counting his remaining cards. Walt Prescott walked up beside John as the crowd thinned and said low and direct, "He's going to go for the contract. The agency affidavit he was waving around that wasn't improvised. That was prepared. Means he had a lawyer working on this before today." "I know," John said. "You've got a lawyer?" "I've got better," John said. "I've got the truth and 3 women willing to testify to it." Walt looked at him with the long, patient skepticism of a man who had lived in Texas long enough to know that the truth and 3 women were not always enough. "You'd better hope the circuit judge gets here before Harlan gets to him." John looked at him. "What does that mean?" Walt was quiet for a moment, which was never a good sign. "Judge Carver rode through Harlan's property 2 weeks ago. Hunting trip. Harlan hosted him 3 nights. He paused. "I only know because my foreman's cousin handles Harlan's stable." The information landed like a stone in still water, and John felt the ripples of it spreading outward into everything he'd been planning. He looked at Clara, who was standing 6 feet away, talking quietly with May, and had not heard this, and he made a decision in the space of 2 seconds to not tell her yet. Not because she couldn't handle it, because she'd already handled enough for one afternoon, and this particular problem needed to be managed before it became her burden. "I'll deal with Carver," John said. Walt looked at him steadily. "How?" "By being a more significant inconvenience than Harlan Pike," John said. "It's worked before." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride into town had been, and the quiet was a different kind. Not the thoughtful quiet of 2 people learning each other, but the pressed-down quiet of 2 people carrying separate weights they hadn't yet decided to share. Clara broke it first. "You heard something in the square," she said. "After Walt spoke to you, your face changed." John kept his eyes on the road. "My face doesn't change." "It does," she said. "You go very still. Most people go still when they're trying to hide that they're worried. You go still when you're already past the worry and into the planning." He looked at her. "I've been watching people my whole life," she said without apology. "It's what you do when you can't afford to misread a room." He told her about Judge Carver. All of it clean and fast, the way she'd told her own story to Cal Briggs, no softening, no managing. She took it in. He watched her take it in without flinching, and he thought again that she was something he hadn't encountered in a long time. A person with genuine structural resilience. Not the brittle kind that looked like strength until the right pressure cracked it, but the flexible kind that bent without breaking, because it had already been bent many times and knew it could come back. "So the warrant arrives," she said slowly. "The judge is compromised. The agency affidavit claims I'm in breach, and Harlan's lawyer argues the San Antonio complaints are from women who were also in breach." She paused. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs to create enough confusion that the whole thing drags out long enough for me to run out of options." "Yes," John said. "And my options at that point are to go back to him or leave the county with nothing." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "He's done this 4 times, she said. "He's very good at it." "He is," John said. "But he's never done it with me in the picture before." Clara looked at him. The late sun was behind them, and in that light she looked both very tired and very awake, which was exactly how John felt, and he suspected for exactly the same reason the particular exhaustion of people who have been running on will and adrenaline and are beginning to feel the edges of it. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Truly, you don't know me. 3 days ago, you didn't know I existed. 3 days ago, you were in a ditch in a dust storm," he said. That's not an answer. He thought about it seriously because she'd asked seriously. "When I was 22 years old," he said, "my father lost our farm. Not to bad luck. To a man who had done something similar to what Harlan's doing, built up debt arrangements, manipulated the legal process, made sure when the moment came, my father had no one who would stand up with him." He paused. "My father was not a weak man. He was a proud man who got isolated and then cornered. I watched that happen." Another pause. "I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had enough standing to put myself between someone and that corner, I would do it." Clara was very quiet. "I'm sorry about your father," she said finally. "He recovered," John said. "Eventually, but it took 10 years and it cost him something he never got back." He glanced at her. "I don't want that for you." She looked at the road ahead for a moment, and then she said in a voice that was slightly rougher than usual, "I have not had many people decide that my situation was their concern." "I noticed," John said. She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something more complicated. "I'm going to fight this," she said, not to him specifically, more like a declaration to the general air. "Whatever he throws next, I want you to know that. I'm not going to fold up and disappear to make it easier for everyone." "I know that," John said. "I figured that out in the ditch." May had supper ready when they arrived, which was May's way of saying she'd been worried and had converted the worry into something useful. The kitchen smelled like biscuits and roasted meat, and the 2 ranch hands who ate at the main house were conspicuously absent, which was also May's way of saying she'd sent them elsewhere so the table could breathe. They ate mostly in silence, but it was the comfortable kind 3 people who had been through the same long, hard day and didn't need to narrate it to each other. It was over the coffee that May said without prelude, "Dorothy Crane came by this afternoon." John set down his cup. "Here. While you were in town. She didn't come to the door, she came to the gate. Sent her girl in with a note." May produced it from her apron pocket and set it on the table. John read it. Clara leaned over slightly, and he tilted it so she could see. It was short. Dorothy Crane had precise handwriting that pressed hard on the downstrokes. "Mr. Wyatt, I wish to speak with you privately regarding a matter that concerns Miss Edwards's situation. I have information you may find useful. I am available tomorrow morning. D. Crane." John and Clara looked at each other. "She was standing with Harlan in the square this afternoon," Clara said. "She was standing near Harlan," May corrected. "There's a difference. Dorothy Crane has been near Harlan for years because he made himself useful to her. That's not the same as being his." She picked up the note and tucked it back in her pocket with the authority of a woman who had assessed the situation and filed it. She's the kind of woman who backs what she thinks will win. This morning she thought that was Harlan. This afternoon she watched the square. "She's changing sides," John said. "She's repositioning," May said. "Which is not the same thing, but it's useful." "Can she be trusted?" Clara asked. "No," May and John said at the same time. "But she can be used," John added. "If her information is real, we use it. If it's not, we know she's still Harlan's." Clara nodded slowly. "When are you meeting her?" "Tomorrow morning," John said. "You're coming with me." Clara raised an eyebrow. "She asked to speak to you privately." "I know," John said. "Which is exactly why you need to be there." Marshal Tom Haskell arrived at 11 the next morning, which was either good timing or extremely inconvenient, depending on where Harlan Pike was at that exact moment. He was a lean, weathered man of 50, with the unhurried manner of someone who'd ridden a long way on many occasions, and had learned that the urgency of 1 hour rarely survives contact with the facts of the next. He came directly to John's ranch, rather than the sheriff's office, which told John that Cal Briggs had sent him here first, which told him that Cal Briggs had made a decision about whose account he believed. John brought him into the front room, and Clara was there, and the marshal took her account for the second time in 2 days, with the same patience Cal had shown, and a few additional questions that indicated he'd already spoken to at least one of the San Antonio women by telegraph. When she finished, he asked, "Miss Edwards, are you prepared to testify in a formal proceeding?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. Haskell looked at John. "Wyatt, I need to ask you something that you don't have to answer." "Ask it," John said. "What's your personal interest here?" The room was very quiet. Clara looked at the marshal. The marshal looked at John. "I found her in a ditch on my land," John said. Everything after that followed from that. Haskell held the looks for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man who has decided he's gotten the honest version and is moving forward. "I'm serving the warrant this afternoon. I want a deputy from Cal's office present, and I'd like both of you available but not at the scene. Can you manage that?" "Yes," John said. "Good." Haskell stood, picked up his hat. He paused at the door. "One more thing. I received a communication this morning from Judge Carver's clerk. The judge is requesting a delay on the formal hearing. Administrative matter, apparently." John's jaw tightened. "How long a delay?" 30 days. Clara made a small sound. John didn't look at her because if he looked at her, he was going to say something about Judge Carver that a marshal didn't need to hear. "Is that a problem?" Haskell asked, watching John's face with professional attention. "The delay gives Harlan time to move assets and build a local case," John said carefully. 30 days in a small town is enough time to rewrite what people think they saw. Haskell was quiet for a moment. "I can't override a judge's scheduling." "I know that," John said. "But you can note in your report the specific circumstances that make the delay strategically convenient for the defendant." Haskell looked at him for a long moment. "I can do that," he said. He put on his hat. "I'll be at the sheriff's office at 2 o'clock. He left. The door closed and Clara said, 30 days. "It's manageable," John said. "Is it?" He turned to face her. She was standing with her arms crossed, not in anger, but in the posture of a person bracing. 30 days for him to work on this town," she said. 30 days for me to be the woman living at your ranch without... She stopped, pressed her lips together. "People are already talking, John. In 30 days that talk becomes a different kind of problem. For you." It was the first time she'd used his name. He noticed it and so did she, but neither of them acknowledged it. "Let me worry about my reputation," he said. "I'm asking you to let me worry about it too," she said. "Because it affects me. If this town decides that I'm here because I traded one arrangement for a better one, then everything I said in that courthouse, everything in that square, it all gets reframed as a woman who..." Her voice stayed steady, but he could hear the effort it cost. "I didn't come here to belong to anybody, Mr. Wyatt. That was the whole point of leaving Missouri." "I know that," he said. "Then help me find a way to handle this that doesn't cost you more than you've already spent and doesn't make me look like what Harlan will say I am." He thought about it. He thought about it seriously and honestly, the way she deserved. "Dorothy Crane," he said. Clara looked at him. "If Dorothy Crane positions herself as your advocate, or even as a neutral party, who was present and saw what she saw, it changes the narrative," he said. "She's the head of the Ladies' Auxiliary. Her opinion is, whether you said it yourself in that square. If she says publicly that she believes your account, half the town follows her because that's what half the town does. And the other half? Walt and George have the other half." Clara was quiet, working through it. "You think she'll do that?" "I think she came to that gate yesterday because she was already doing the calculation," he said. "She wants to be on the winning side. Let's make sure she understands which one that is." Dorothy Crane arrived at the ranch at 9 the next morning in her good visiting dress, which was itself a signal she'd dressed for a formal call, not a casual one. She sat in the front room with John and Clara and May present, and did not comment on May's presence or Clara's, which was another signal. I want to be clear about why I'm here, she said with the directness of a woman who had decided that the performance of social niceties was costing her more than it was worth. I supported Harlan Pike because he was useful to the auxiliary for 3 years. He donated, he showed up, he said the right things. She folded her hands in her lap. I did not know about San Antonio. You do, John said, and now I do. She looked at Clara. I was not kind to you in the courthouse. I'd like to correct that. Clara studied her. Why? Dorothy Crane met her eyes, and something in her expression shifted from the practiced social register she usually occupied into something more genuine. Because I have a daughter, she said. She lives in Kansas now. She married a man who... A pause. A brief, controlled pause. She's managing. But I know what certain kinds of managing look like. She paused again. I should have recognized it in you earlier. I chose not to, which tells me something about myself I'd rather not sit with. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at this woman, the woman who had stood on the courthouse steps and counseled her toward social propriety, who had been near Harlan in the square. And she did not perform forgiveness. And she did not perform warmth, because Clara Edwards had learned that performed emotions were a currency she could no longer afford to spend. What are you willing to do? Clara asked. Dorothy Crane reached into her bag and produced a folded paper. I've written a statement, describing what I observed at the courthouse and in the square. My own observations, my own signature. She set it on the table. I'm also prepared to speak to 3 other auxiliary members who I believe will corroborate the general character of what Harlan Pike has presented to this community over the past 3 years. A pause. And I have one more thing. She reached into her bag again and produced a second paper. 2 years ago, she said, Harlan Pike asked me to sign a character reference for the agency. He said it was a formality. I signed it without reading it carefully. She set the second paper on the table beside the first. I read it carefully this morning. My signature appears on a document that describes Caldwell County as a prosperous community with strong moral oversight and uses that description to justify the agency's placement practices. Her jaw was tight. I did not consent to my name being used that way. And I am prepared to say so in writing to the marshal. John looked at the papers. Then he looked at Dorothy Crane. That took courage, he said. It took embarrassment, she said crisply. But I understand they sometimes feel the same. Clara reached across the table and picked up Dorothy's statement. She read it slowly, carefully, the way she read everything with the attention of a woman who had learned not to trust until trust had been earned word by word. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Dorothy. Thank you, she said. I mean that. Dorothy Crane nodded once. Then she picked up her bag, stood, and said to John, I'll speak to the marshal today. You might also want to know that Harlan's lawyer is arriving from San Antonio on tomorrow's stage. How do you know that? May asked. Because his lawyer is Marcus Dole, and Marcus Dole's wife is in my auxiliary, and Marcus Dole's wife does not keep secrets well when she's anxious. Dorothy put on her hat. He's bringing the original agency contract and what he's describing to his wife as a counter-complaint. I don't know the details. She left. May closed the door behind her and turned around and said, a counter-complaint. Harlan's going to claim I damaged his property or reputation, Clara said. She said it flatly, like someone identifying a move they'd already seen coming. He'll say I abandoned the contract, cost him the agency fee, caused public humiliation. She looked at John. If his lawyer's good, he files it before the marshal's warrant is formally processed and creates a parallel proceeding. John stood up. Then we have today and tonight. He crossed to his desk, pulled out paper, and looked at Clara. I need you to write everything down. Again. Every detail you remember from every interaction with Harlan Pike from the moment you stepped off that stage. Times words, exact words, if you can remember them, sequence of events. He paused. And anything from before, from Missouri, from the agency correspondence. Anything you signed, anything they sent you, any promises that were made in writing. Clara stood up too. I kept the letters, she said. He stopped. What? The agency correspondence. Harlan's letters before I traveled. She crossed to her travel bag, which was still on the chair by the window, and opened the side pocket and produced a small bundle of folded papers tied with a piece of brown string. I keep everything I sign, she said. I learned that from my father's mistakes. John stared at the letters. May made a sound from the doorway that might have been a laugh or might have been a prayer. Clara, John said slowly, do those letters contain any promises about the terms of the arrangement? She untied the string and opened the top letter and read for a moment. He promised a furnished home, a working ranch, the marriage to take place within 30 days of arrival, and... She paused reading, and a provision that if either party chose not to proceed, the traveling party would be provided with return passage and $60 compensation. He promised you $60 and a return ticket if it didn't work out, John said. In writing, Clara said, and instead, he left you on foot in a dust storm. In July. She looked up. In Texas. May sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, pressed both hands to her face, and said muffled, Sweet merciful Lord. John looked at Clara, at the letters in her hands, at the look on her face, which was not triumphant, not yet, but had something in it that he recognized as a specific kind of relief. The relief of a person who kept the receipts and had just discovered they matter. We have him, John said. Clara held the letters carefully like they were something fragile, which they were fragile and true and worth everything that the next 30 days were going to demand of both of them. Not yet, she said. But we will. Outside somewhere down the road toward Caldwell, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and Marcus Dole's stage was one day out, and Harlan Pike was building his last defense with the furious concentration of a man who had finally understood that he was losing. And losing to a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles, been left in a Texas dust storm, and kept every letter she'd ever been sent. John Wyatt looked at her and thought not for the first time that he had never in his life met anyone quite like Clara Edwards. And somewhere in the back of his chest, behind the strategy and the planning and the hard arithmetic of the fight ahead, something that had been quiet and cold for a very long time was doing something he hadn't expected. It was waking up. Marcus Dole arrived on the noon stage. John knew it the moment May walked into the front room, with her mouth set in the particular line that meant she had information she didn't like. He was at his desk with Clara's letters spread in front of him. They'd been working since dawn, organizing every piece of documentation into an order that told the story the way it actually happened, not the way Harlan Pike's lawyer was about to claim it had. Stage came in, May said. My friend Alice says a man got off with a leather briefcase and went directly to Harlan's property. Didn't even stop at the hotel. John looked at Clara. Clara looked at the letters. How much time do we have? She asked. If Dole's good, he'll have the counter-complaint filed with Cal's office before supper, John said. Which means we need to be at the marshal's office before that. Clara was already stacking the letters in order, her hands quick and certain. She'd been up since before dawn. He'd heard her moving in the kitchen at 5, and when he'd come down, she'd been at the table with a lamp and a piece of paper, writing in a tight, clear hand that pressed hard on every word like she was nailing each one down. She'd looked up when he appeared, not startled, just present. I'm writing the timeline, she'd said. Every date I can document. Every promise against every action. He'd sat down across from her, and they'd worked through it together in the early quiet. And he'd thought then that he had never in his adult life sat across a table from a person at 5 in the morning and felt less alone. He didn't say that, but he thought it. Now she tied the letters back into their bundle, tucked them inside her coat, and stood up. Let's go. Marshal Haskell was already at the courthouse when they arrived, which meant Cal Briggs had gotten word to him fast. He was standing with Cal and a second man John didn't recognize, late 40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a suit that said he'd come from somewhere larger than Caldwell. Haskell made the introduction. Wyatt, Miss Edwards, this is Deputy Marshal Reed out of Austin. He arrived this morning on my request. Given the involvement of a sitting circuit judge, I thought it appropriate to have additional federal presence. John shook Reed's hand and understood two things simultaneously. Haskell had taken the note in his report about Judge Carver more seriously than his neutral expression had suggested, and the situation had grown legs that were now walking in directions none of them had fully planned for. "The judge," John said carefully. "Judge Carver filed the 30-day delay request this morning," Reed said. He had the flat, measured delivery of someone trained to present facts without editorial. Deputy Marshal's office received a separate communication 2 hours ago. Anonymous but specific. It alleges that Judge Carver accepted a private payment from a third party 6 days ago in connection with a property matter in Caldwell County. A pause. The amount cited matches to the dollar a withdrawal from Harlan Pike's account at Craddock's bank, which Mr. Craddock confirmed under considerable persuasion this morning. The room was completely still. Clara said very quietly, "He bribed the judge." "The allegation is that he did," Reed said. "We are treating it as credible pending investigation." He looked at Haskell. "The 30-day delay is suspended. The formal hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning." John absorbed this. Tomorrow. Not 30 days of Harlan rebuilding his position brick by brick. Not 30 days of the town's memory softening at the edges. Not 30 days of Marcus Dole building a counter-narrative. Tomorrow. He looked at Clara. Something had moved through her face. Not relief yet, because she was too careful for relief, but the particular tightening of a person who has been holding themselves braced against a long fall and has just been told the ground is closer than they thought. "Tomorrow," she said. 9 o'clock, Haskell said. He looked at the letters in her hand. "Are those the agency documents?" She set them on Cal's desk. Every letter, every promise. Dated and in his handwriting. Haskell and Reed exchanged a look that was brief and professional and contained. John thought a quantity of satisfaction that neither of them was going to express out loud. Marcus Dole filed the counter-complaint at 4:15. John heard about it from Walt Prescott, who heard about it from the clerk's office, who heard about it from the clerk herself, who told Walt because she'd worked for Walt's wife for 10 years and trusted the Prescott family with information the way you trust a bank vault. The counter-complaint alleged breach of contract, abandonment of residence, and the part that made John's jaw set, defamation. Harlan was claiming that Clara's public statements in the square had damaged his reputation and his standing in the business community. John was in the kitchen with May when Walt delivered this, and May said nothing, only refilled his coffee, and John said nothing, only drank it. When Walt left, May said, "The defamation claim is aimed at you, not her. He knows you were the one who had standing to make those statements land. She's the mechanism. You're the target." "I know that," John said. "It means even if Clara wins tomorrow, he comes after your assets in a civil suit." "I know that too." May set down the coffee pot and looked at him with the directness she reserved for things that mattered. "Is it worth it truly? I'm asking you honestly because I've watched you build this ranch for 20 years, and I'd like to know that you've thought about what you're risking." John was quiet for a long moment. "When Sarah died," he said, and he almost never said her name aloud, and May went very still. "The thing I couldn't fix was that I hadn't been there. I was riding the far pasture. She went alone into something hard, and I was a mile away not knowing." He set down his cup. "I've spent 11 years being careful about what I got close enough to lose." He paused. "I'm done being that careful." May looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee pot, turned back to the stove, and said, "I'll make something good for supper. You're going to need your strength tomorrow." That was the closest May Givens had ever come to giving her blessing on anything, and John understood it exactly for what it was. Clara was in the back garden when he found her standing at the fence with both hands wrapped around the top rail, looking out at the flat evening land. She heard him coming and didn't turn around, which meant she'd heard his step on the ground and recognized it, and that small fact did something quiet to him that he didn't examine. "Walt told me about the counter-complaint," she said. "I figured he would. The defamation claim is about you." "Yes." She turned around then, and her face had the expression he'd learned to read over the past 4 days. The one that was working hard to stay composed around something that wanted very much to be otherwise. John, if he wins that claim? He won't, John said. You don't know that. I know that I said true things in a public place to a public gathering, he said. Truth is a complete defense to defamation. Marcus Dole knows that. This is a pressure tactic, not a winnable suit. And if the judge is still compromised, if there's a second judge who owes Harlan something, Clara. He said it steady and direct. Look at me. She looked at him. I need you to hear this clearly, he said. Not because I'm asking you to stop worrying. Worrying is reasonable, and I'm doing some of it myself. But because tomorrow you are going to walk into that courthouse and tell your story in front of a room full of people who have been listening to Harlan Pike's version for 4 days, and I need you going in there with all of yourself present. Not the part that's spending energy on what happens to my assets. He paused. Can you do that? She held his gaze. You're asking me not to care what happens to you. I'm asking you to trust that I can handle what happens to me. That's different, she said. Yes, he said. It is. A long moment passed between them, the kind of moment that is made up of many smaller things being weighed and decided. I trust you, she said. I want you to know that's not something I say easily. I know it isn't, he said. It means something. She turned back to the fence and looked at the land. And after a moment, he stood beside her at the rail, and they were quiet together, in the way they'd gotten quiet together, which was not empty, but full. Full of everything that 4 days of standing in the same direction had built between two people who had both learned to be careful with trust and were both slowly becoming less careful with each other. Tell me something about this land, she said. Not about tomorrow, just tell me something. He thought about it. That ridge to the east, he said, there's a spring up there that runs cold even in July. I found it my second summer here. I was 26, and I'd just bought the first parcel, and I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. The land was drier than I'd expected, and the cattle were losing weight, and I was thinking about the money I didn't have. He paused. I climbed up there one evening to see if I could see the creek from the ridge, and I found that spring instead. It was coming out of the rock, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. He was quiet a moment. I thought, if this land has something like that in it that I didn't know about yet, maybe I can figure the rest of it out. Clara was listening with the quality of attention she gave to things she was keeping. Did you, she asked, figure the rest of it out? Most of it, he said. Still working on some. She almost smiled. He saw the edge of it. Me too, she said. The courthouse at 9 the next morning was standing room. This was not an official public hearing. It was a formal deposition proceeding with the marshal present. But Caldwell was a small town, and a small town treats a proceeding like this the way water treats a low space. It fills it. Walt Prescott was there with George Hadley. Dorothy Crane was seated in the second row with 2 other auxiliary women, whose presence she had clearly organized. Pastor Foote was present, but seated near the back, which John read as a man trying to remain available to whichever side prevailed. Harlan Pike sat at one table with Marcus Dole, who was good. John could see it immediately in the way the man arranged his papers and held his posture the ease of someone who had done this many times in larger rooms than this. Clara sat at the other table with John beside her and a lawyer named James Fitch, who had ridden in from the county seat the night before, a man John had used twice in land disputes, quiet and thorough, and the kind of lawyer who won by being more prepared than anyone expected. Deputy Marshal Reed sat at the front. Cal Briggs stood at the wall. Haskell was not present. John noted that, and noted that Reed had taken the primary seat, and understood that the federal dimension of this had grown overnight into something none of them could fully see yet. Reed opened the proceeding, and the room went quiet. Marcus Dole went first as the filing party in the counter-complaint. He was smooth and sequential. He laid out the contract, the agency relationship, the terms Clara's arrival and her subsequent departure from the residence, which he described as voluntary and unilateral. He was careful not to mention the dust storm directly. He framed it as a woman who had arrived, found the arrangement unsatisfactory, and chosen to leave without notice or discussion, causing his client financial and reputational harm. He did not mention the letters. which meant Harlan hadn't told him about the letters, which meant Harlan didn't know Clara had kept them. John watched Dole build his case on a foundation that was about to have a hole cut through it, and he kept his face completely still. When Dole finished, Reed looked at James Fitch. Fitch stood, buttoned his coat, and said, "Deputy Marshal Reed, I'd like to enter into the record a series of documents." He laid out the letters one by one. He read the relevant passages aloud: the home, the working ranch, the 30-day marriage provision, and specifically the return passage and $60 compensation clause. He read them in Harlan Pike's own handwriting, in Harlan Pike's own words, and he read them in a room so quiet that every word landed like a stone on still water. Then he said, Miss Edwards did not abandon the arrangement. She was removed from it, forcibly, without the compensation promised in the contract she signed, in July heat, during a documented dust storm. Marcus Dole's composure held, but his pen had stopped moving. Harlan was looking at the letters with the expression of a man watching something he'd believed was safely buried get dug up in front of a room full of people. Fitch was not done. He entered Dorothy Crane's statement. He entered Walt Prescott's account of the water easement. He entered the testimony of Harlan's former employee, the one who'd seen the grain dilution delivered by written affidavit, because the man had left the county but had agreed via telegraph to provide a sworn statement when Walt reached him 3 days ago. Each document landed in the room and stayed there. The pile of them was not just evidence. It was a pattern, and a room full of people who lived in small-town Texas in 1878 knew how to read a pattern when it was laid in front of them. Then James Fitch said, "I'd also like to enter a communication received this morning from Deputy Marshal Reed's office in Austin." Reed nodded. Fitch read it. The room heard that Judge Carver had recused himself from all Caldwell County proceedings, pending a federal inquiry into the payment allegation. The room heard that a replacement judge appointed from Austin would hear all outstanding matters. The room heard that the replacement judge's first act had been to reject the 30-day delay and affirm tomorrow's hearing date as today. The room heard all of this, and then the room looked at Harlan Pike. And Harlan Pike, for the first time in everything John had witnessed over the past 5 days, looked small. Not physically. He was the same man he'd always been. But the room had shifted around him in the way rooms shift when a thing that was propped up has its supports removed, and what it revealed was not a powerful man in a difficult situation, but a man whose power had always been borrowed from silence, from isolation, from the careful management of what other people knew. The silence was gone. The isolation was gone. And every person in that room now knew. Dole spoke privately with Harlan for 4 minutes after Fitch finished. John watched it from across the room, the low, urgent exchange, Harlan's jaw tight, Dole's face carrying the neutral professional expression of a lawyer explaining to a client that the arithmetic has changed. At the end of 4 minutes, Dole stood and said to Reed, "My client would like to propose a resolution." The room inhaled. The resolution Dole proposed was this: Harlan Pike would withdraw the countercomplaint. He would formally release Clara from any and all contractual obligations and provide the $60 compensation specified in the original agreement. He would not contest the marshal's warrant proceedings. In exchange, the defamation claim against John Wyatt would be dropped, and no civil action would be pursued against the ranch. Reed looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at Clara. Clara looked at John. John said nothing. This was her decision. He'd made that clear to Fitch before the proceeding. Whatever resolution came to the table, Clara Edwards made the call. She sat with it for a moment. The room waited. "No," she said. Dole looked at her. Harlan looked at her. Reed looked at her. Half the room looked at her. "The $60 and the release," she said, "yes. But the marshal's warrant proceedings continue. Whatever San Antonio charges exists, those women get their hearing. That is not mine to trade away." She looked at Dole steadily. "The counter-complaint against Mr. Wyatt is dropped as part of the resolution. The warrant proceedings are not. Those are two separate things." Dole looked at Harlan. Something passed between them. Harlan Pike looked at Clara Edwards across the room, and in his expression was a thing that had no performance left in it, just the raw, stripped acknowledgement of a man who had built his entire method around women who had no one to stand with them. Encountering finally one who did. "Fine," Harlan said. Clara turned to look at John. He gave her the smallest nod that existed. She turned back to the front and sat completely straight, the way she'd sat on a horse in a dust storm. The way she'd sat in a ditch and waited without knowing if anyone was coming, with the posture of a woman who had never, not once, stopped holding herself up. The $60 came by bank order that afternoon, delivered to Cal Briggs's office by Craddock's assistant, with the efficiency of an institution, eager to be associated with the winning side. Clara held the order in both hands and looked at it for a long time. May, who had ridden into town with them and had been present for all of it, watched her from across the office and said nothing, which was the most respectful thing May knew how to offer. "It's not enough," Clara said, not bitterly, just as a fact. "No," May agreed. "It isn't." "But it's mine," Clara said. "He promised it, and now he's paid it, and that means what was promised to me I got. Not because I was lucky, not because someone gave it to me." She folded the bank order carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "Because I kept the letters." John was standing at the doorway, and he heard that, and he thought as clearly and simply as he'd ever thought anything that he wanted to know this woman for a very long time. He walked across the office to where she was standing, and he said, "What do you want to do now?" She looked at him. There was something open in her face that hadn't been there 5 days ago, not unguarded, because Clara Edwards was never fully unguarded, and he suspected she never would be, and he respected that, but less closed. Like a door that had been bolted from the inside and had been opened one careful inch. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the first honest answer I've had to that question in a long time." A pause. "Is that all right?" "That's better than all right," he said. "That means you've got room to decide." She almost smiled, a real one, the full version, the one she'd been keeping close. "May said you need help at the ranch." "May says a lot of things," John said. "She said you've been short a hand since March, and that your record keeping is an embarrassment, and that nobody organizes the supply orders properly." From across the room, May said, without looking up from the document she was signing, "I said exactly that." "She's not wrong," John said. Clara looked at him with the clear, direct attention that he'd come to understand was the way she looked at things she was deciding to trust. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking for work. Fair pay, fair terms, my own written agreement this time." A pause. "I'm good with numbers. I'm organized. I don't frighten easily. And I have exactly $60 and no particular place to be." "Those are reasonable terms," John said. "I thought so. I'll have Fitch draw up an agreement tomorrow." "Today," she said. He looked at her. "Today," she said again. "I've learned not to let the important things wait until tomorrow." "Today," he agreed. May stood up, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door with the satisfaction of a woman whose opinion had been vindicated by events. "I'll get the horses," she said. "You two finish up." The door closed behind her, and the office was quiet, and John Wyatt and Clara Edwards stood in the late afternoon of a July day in Caldwell, Texas, and the distance between them was smaller than it had been that morning, and smaller than it had been the morning before, and it had been getting smaller every single day since he'd found her in a ditch, and she'd grabbed a fence rail and hauled herself upright rather than wait for a hand she wasn't sure was coming. "John," she said. "Yeah, thank you." She said it simply, without the weight she'd put on it 4 days ago when she'd said it on the courthouse steps. That version had been polite, careful, the thanks of a woman keeping her distance. This version was different. This version meant something specific. Not for the help, for how you helped. There's a difference. He knew exactly what she meant. He'd been on the receiving end of help that came with a hand wrapped around your wrist, and she had too, and neither of them was the same as what had happened in the last 5 days, which had been from the first moment on that road, a man and a woman standing in the same direction and moving forward together without either of them losing their own footing. I know the difference too, he said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something had been settled, and picked up her bag and walked toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. The supply orders, she said with the edge of something that was almost finally a full smile. They really are a mess. I know, he said. I've been ignoring them. You won't be able to ignore them anymore, she said. No, John Wyatt said. I don't expect I will. That evening, May made a real supper. Not the practical worried supper of the night before, but an actual celebration, the kind she made when something worth marking had happened. The kitchen was warm and loud, and the two ranch hands were back at the table, and Walt Prescott had ridden out because May had invited him, which Walt claimed was unexpected, but which he'd arrived for promptly, and with a bottle of something decent. Clara sat at the table in the middle of all of it, and ate, and listened and spoke, when she had something to say, which was more often than it had been 5 days ago, and the table felt, John thought, from his end of it, like what a table was supposed to feel like. After supper, Clara went to the back porch to get some air, and John followed her out, and they stood in the dark Texas evening, with the heat still in the air, but gentler now, the way July nights sometimes relented, and the stars overhead were the particular bright, unobstructed kind you only got this far from a city. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask it. Do you think people can actually change what they come from? Not forget it, not pretend it wasn't real, but build something on top of it that means more than it did. He thought about his father's farm, about Sarah, about 11 years of running a ranch alone and calling it peace when it was really just the absence of risk, about the last 5 days which had been the most dangerous and the most alive he'd felt in a very long time. Yes, he said, but I think you have to decide that what you're building is yours, not a replacement for what you lost, not a reaction against what hurt you. He paused. Just yours. Something you made because you chose to. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think I'm starting to understand what that looks like. Me too, John said. More recently than I'd like to admit. She looked at him sideways with that almost smile, and he thought again what he'd thought every day since the ditch, that this woman was something extraordinary, not in spite of what she'd been through, but shaped by it, pressed by it into a form that was precise and clear and harder than most things, and capable of far more warmth than she'd yet had occasion to show. He didn't say any of that. Some things were too early for words, and he'd learned in 55 years of life in the American West that the things that lasted were usually the things that were built slowly, with good materials and honest hands, without rushing the foundation. But he stood beside her in the Texas dark, and she stood beside him, and neither of them moved away. In Caldwell County, in the summer of 1878, a woman had come 1,000 miles on the strength of a written promise, and found instead the oldest and most common kind of trap, a man who had counted on her having no one and nothing and nowhere to go. She had arrived with a travel bag, $60 worth of letters, and a spine that 4 days of Texas dust and courtroom pressure and small-town judgment had not bent by a single degree, and she had built herself a foothold in the hardest possible ground, and stood on it, and held her own name, and earned her own terms, and chosen her own next step. Not because anyone gave it to her, and not because she was rescued, but because Clara Edwards had always understood in the part of herself that no one had ever managed to reach, that a person's worth is not granted by circumstance, or assigned by society, or confirmed by a man's approval. It is built. Day by day, decision by decision, letter by letter, in the places where it would have been easier to fold and you didn't. That was the truth. She had carried 1,000 miles without knowing she was carrying it. And standing on a Texas porch in the July dark, next to a man who had ridden into a dust storm for a stranger, and had not in 5 days once asked her to be less than she was, she finally fully knew it. Some things once known cannot be taken back, and Clara Edwards had never been the kind of woman who let go of what was hers.